October 14th, 1943. 16:47 hours. Thorpe Abbotts, England. The B-17 Flying Fortress shuddered to a stop on the runway, its number 3 engine completely dead, number 2 smoking. Lieutenant Colonel James Shannon counted the holes as he walked around the aircraft. 17 through the left wing, 23 in the fuselage, 8 more clustered around the tail gunner's position. The metal skin looked like a colander. His navigator, Lieutenant Frank Morrison, climbed down through the nose hatch, his flight suit soaked with sweat despite the sub-zero temperatures at 25,000 feet. "Skipper, we shouldn't be alive," Morrison said, his voice tight. "Jerry threw everything at us over Schweinfurt." Shannon ran his hand along a line of bullet holes that traced the entire length of the fuselage, missing the fuel tanks by inches. Around him, other fortresses were landing, many trailing smoke, some firing red flares indicating wounded aboard. Of the 291 B-17s that had departed for Schweinfurt that morning to bomb ball-bearing factories, 60 hadn't made it back. Another 17 would be written off as beyond repair. 121 of the survivors needed significant repairs before flying again. The mathematics were brutal. At this loss rate, a bomber crew's statistical chance of surviving their required 25 mission tour was less than 30%. But as Colonel Shannon stood examining his damaged bomber, counting holes and wondering how they'd survived, 200 miles away in a nondescript apartment building near Columbia University in Manhattan, a Hungarian-Jewish refugee mathematician was about to solve a problem that would save hundreds of bomber crews. His name was Abraham Wald, and his insight would revolutionize not just military strategy, but the entire field of statistical analysis. The damaged bomber Shannon flew was exactly the kind of data the United States Army Air Forces had been collecting for months. Every B-17 that returned from missions over Germany was meticulously examined. Each bullet hole was mapped, catalogued, measured. Technical sergeants with clipboards would walk around the aircraft, marking damage locations on standardized diagrams. The data was overwhelming in its consistency. The fuselage took the most hits, averaging 1.73 bullet holes per square foot. The wings came second at 1.21 holes per square foot. The fuel system showed 1.55 hits per square foot. But certain areas, particularly around the engines and cockpit, showed remarkably little damage, sometimes as few as 0.3 hits per square foot. To the military brass at Wright Field in Ohio, the solution seemed obvious. Major General Oliver Echols, Chief of the Material Command, had called a meeting in September 1943. "Gentlemen, the data speaks for itself," he said, pointing to a chart showing damage distribution across a B-17 silhouette. "We need to reinforce these areas taking the most damage, add armor plating to the fuselage, strengthen the wings." The logic appeared unassailable. You armor where the enemy bullets hit most frequently. But Eccles had a problem: weight. A B-17G already weighed 36,135 pounds empty. Every pound of armor added meant less bomb load, less fuel capacity, reduced maneuverability. The fortress could carry approximately 1,500 pounds of additional armor, but that armor had to be placed strategically. Put it in the wrong place, and you'd burden the aircraft for no protective benefit. The Air Force needed mathematical precision, not military intuition. 6 weeks before that disastrous Schweinfurt raid, the problem had been handed to the Statistical Research Group at Columbia University. The SRG occupied 3 floors of an apartment building near the Columbia campus, its windows painted black for security, its existence largely unknown even to most military personnel. Inside worked 18 of America's finest mathematical minds, recruited through what SRG Director Alan Wallace called the Old Boy Network of academic statistics. They had already solved problems ranging from the optimal pattern for naval convoy formations to the mathematical probability of hitting targets with the Norden bomb sight. Abraham Wald had joined the group in 1943. one of many European refugee scholars who would profoundly impact the American war effort. Born in 1902 in Kolozsvár, then part of Austria-Hungary, now Cluj-Napoca, Romania, Wald had been homeschooled by his parents because, as an Orthodox Jew, he couldn't attend school on Saturdays as Hungarian law required. His mathematical genius had earned him a position at the University of Vienna, but the 1938 Anschluss had ended his career there. He'd fled to America, where Columbia University had offered him a position. Now, instead of working on pure mathematical theory, he was applying his intellect to keeping American airmen alive. The Air Force delivered their data to the SRG in late August 1943. Boxes of reports, thousands of damage assessments, photographs, measurements. Captain Robert McNamara, then working with the Air Force's Office of Statistical Control, had supervised the data collection. Every returning bomber from the 8th Air Force based in England had been examined. The patterns were clear and consistent. Heavy damage to fuselage and wings, minimal damage to engines and cockpit areas. Wald spent 3 days examining the data in silence. His colleague, economist Milton Friedman, later recalled, Abraham would sit there smoking his pipe, saying nothing for hours. Then suddenly he'd make a mark on paper and return to silence. The other statisticians at SRG had already begun calculating optimal armor distribution based on hit frequency when Wald finally spoke at their September 2nd meeting. "You are all wrong," he said simply. "The Air Force is wrong. You are looking at this backwards." The room fell silent. Frederick Mostella, a young statistician who would later become president of the American Statistical Association, asked what everyone was thinking. "Abraham, the data is clear. These areas receive the most damage. How can reinforcing them be wrong?" Wald stood and walked to the blackboard. He drew a simple B-17 outline, then marked the areas showing heavy damage in the Air Force data. "These planes returned," he said. "They took this damage and survived. Every plane you examine took hits here," he pointed to the fuselage and wings, "and still made it home." He then drew another B-17 outline. "Where are the planes that didn't return? What did their damage patterns look like?" He marked the areas showing little damage in the returning aircraft data, the engines, the cockpit, the tail control surfaces. If damage were truly uniform, we should see equal distribution across all areas. We don't. The missing damage is on the missing planes. The revelation was like a thunderbolt. Statistician Leonard Jimmy Savage would later call it one of the most elegant insights of the war. The Air Force had been looking at survivors and assuming they represented all aircraft. Wald recognized they were seeing only half the picture, the half that lived to tell the tale. "Consider it mathematically," Wald continued, writing equations on the board. "Let us assume reasonably that enemy fire is essentially random, that German anti-aircraft gunners and fighter pilots aren't precisely aiming at specific aircraft components from thousands of feet away. If fire is random, damage should be uniformly distributed across the aircraft's surface." He wrote out the probability distributions. If we see non-uniform distribution in returning aircraft, and we assume uniform distribution of enemy fire, then we must conclude that aircraft hit in the underrepresented areas did not return. These are your critical areas. These are where armor belongs. George Stigler, the economist who would win a Nobel Prize in 1982, was in the room. He later wrote, "It was so obvious once Abraham explained it, yet none of us had seen it. We were all looking at the data. Abraham was looking at what wasn't in the data. The implications were staggering. The Air Force had been preparing to add armor to the areas that could best survive damage while leaving critical areas exposed. It would have been precisely backwards, potentially making losses worse rather than better." Wald's insight cut through months of planning with pure mathematical logic. But Wald wasn't finished. Over the next 3 weeks, he developed a comprehensive mathematical model for optimal armor placement. His work, eventually compiled in 8 memoranda, went far beyond simple observation. He calculated vulnerability coefficients for different aircraft areas, factoring in not just hit probability, but functional criticality. A hit to the aileron control cables, for instance, was far more likely to be fatal than multiple hits to non-structural fuselage areas. On September 20th, 1943, Wald presented his complete analysis to Air Force representatives. Brigadier General Orville Anderson, head of the 8th Bomber Command, had flown in from England specifically for the meeting. Anderson was skeptical. "Professor Wald, you're asking us to ignore actual battle damage we can see and armor areas that appear undamaged." Wald pulled out a statistical analysis of the previous month's losses. "General, your loss rates are unsustainable. In August, you lost 60 B-17s attempting to bomb Schweinfurt and Regensburg. That's 600 men. Your own data shows that 38 of those aircraft were seen to suffer engine failures before going down. Engine armor could have saved them." He showed another chart. "Here's your June raid on Kiel. You lost 26 aircraft. Witness reports from returning crews indicate at least 15 went down after cockpit hits. Yet in your surviving aircraft, cockpit damage is minimal. This is not coincidence. This is what I call survivorship bias. We only see the survivors." The term was new, coined by Wald himself during his analysis. It would become fundamental to statistical analysis, but in that moment, it was revolutionary. Anderson studied the data, then asked his aide, Major Thomas Powers, for the latest loss reports. The numbers were indeed unsustainable. The 8th Air Force was losing aircraft faster than they could be replaced. "How much weight are we talking about?" Anderson asked. Wald had anticipated this. "Based on my calculations, 1,200 pounds of armor optimally placed around engines, cockpit, and control cables would be more effective than 2,000 pounds distributed according to observed damage patterns." The challenge wasn't just mathematical, but practical. The B-17's Wright Cyclone engines were already vulnerable to mechanical failure without enemy action. Adding armor meant redesigning engine cowlings, shifting weight distributions, recalculating center of gravity. Boeing engineer Edward Wells, who had helped design the B-17, was brought in to consult. "It's possible," he said after reviewing Wald's recommendations, "but it means retrofitting every B-17 in England." By October 1943, when Black Thursday saw 77 B-17s lost in a single day, the Air Force was desperate. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, personally ordered implementation of Wald's recommendations. The retrofit program began immediately. Crews at modification centers in England worked around the clock, adding armor plates to engines, installing bulletproof glass in critical cockpit areas, reinforcing control cable runs. Technical Sergeant William Haney, working at the Honington Modification Center, remembered the urgency. "We had birds coming in all shot up from missions, and we're trying to patch them while adding these new armor kits. Orders were to prioritize Wald modifications over everything except critical repairs." The changes weren't immediately popular with crews. Captain Robert Morgan, pilot of the famous Memphis Belle, which along with Hell's Angels was among the first B-17s to complete 25 missions on May 17, 1943, was initially skeptical. "We're already flying overloaded. Now they want to add more weight to places that never get hit." But Morgan was looking at his own experience, his own survival, not understanding he was part of the statistical bias Wald had identified. The first modified B-17S flew combat missions in November 1943. The results were immediate and dramatic. Loss rates began declining even as missions increased in intensity. By December, despite flying deeper into Germany than ever before, the 8th Air Force's loss rate per sortie had dropped from 9.1% to 3.5%. The modification program expanded, eventually encompassing all American heavy bombers. Lieutenant Colonel John Bennett, who flew 31 missions in both unmodified and modified B-17s, noticed the difference. My first tour, every mission felt like Russian roulette. After the modifications, we still got shot up, but more birds made it home. Crews that would have gone down were limping back. The numbers told the story. In the 6 months before Wald's modifications, the 8th Air Force lost 606 B-17s. In the 6 months after full implementation, despite flying more missions against better defended targets, losses dropped to 371. Each bomber saved meant 10 men who returned home instead of becoming casualties or prisoners of war. But Wald's impact went far beyond armor placement. His work revolutionized military analysis. The Navy began applying his methods to ship survival. The British RAF retroactively analysed their own bomber losses and found similar patterns. Even the Germans, through captured documents, learned of Wald's work and began applying similar analysis to their own aircraft. Colonel Curtis LeMay, who would later lead the strategic bombing campaign against Japan, studied Wald's memoranda obsessively. "Wald taught us to look for what wasn't there," LeMay wrote. "In war, the most important data is often the data you can't collect." The concept had immediate applications beyond aviation. When analysing infantry casualties, medics realised they were seeing only soldiers who survived long enough to reach aid stations. This led to changes in battlefield first aid priorities, focusing on injuries that were survivable with immediate intervention. Back at the Statistical Research Group, Wald's success with bomber survivability led to expanded responsibilities. He developed sequential analysis methods for quality control in ammunition production, saving millions of rounds from unnecessary testing. His work on optimal search patterns for finding downed pilots in the Pacific saved dozens of lives. Herbert Solomon, another SRG statistician, later reflected on Wald's unique approach. "Most of us looked at problems directly. Abraham always asked what we weren't seeing. He had survived the Holocaust by escaping Austria just in time. Perhaps that made him more aware of the danger of only counting survivors." The human impact was felt in countless individual stories. Staff Sergeant James Hensley, a ball turret gunner with the 381 bomb group, was hit by flak over Berlin in March 1944. Shell fragment came right through the turret, hit the armor plate they'd added behind my head. Before Wald's modifications, that would have killed me. Instead, I just got my bell rung. Technical Sergeant Roy Vasquez, a flight engineer with the 91st Bomb Group, experienced similar salvation. Lost number 2 engine to flak over Frankfurt. Before the armor upgrades, losing an engine usually meant fire, then bail out or blow up. But the armor protected the fuel lines. We made it home on 3 engines. The modifications weren't perfect. Some crews complained about reduced speed and maneuverability. The added weight meant longer takeoff runs, critical when operating from England's often foggy, shortened runways. Fuel consumption increased slightly, but these drawbacks paled compared to improved survival rates. By early 1944, Wald's work had become doctrine. The Air Force's Statistical Control Office, led by Charles Tex Thornton, integrated survivorship bias analysis into all operational planning. When the P-51 Mustang was introduced as a long-range escort fighter, analysts used Wald's methods to determine optimal fuel tank armor, significantly reducing losses to ground fire. The impact extended to the Pacific theater. B-29 superfortresses bombing Japan received armor configurations based on Wald's analysis adapted for Pacific conditions. Navy dive bombers and torpedo planes were similarly protected. Marine Corps aviation units reported dramatic improvements in aircraft survivability during island-hopping campaigns. Captain Robert McNamara, who had helped collect the original bomber damage data, later became Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War. He often cited Wald's work as an example of how quantitative analysis could save lives. Wald showed us that intuition, even informed military intuition, could be precisely wrong. Mathematics doesn't lie. The German response to American bomber modifications revealed their recognition of Wald's impact. Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland wrote in his memoirs, "The Americans suddenly became harder to kill. Our pilots reported that shots which should have been fatal were not bringing down bombers. We suspected armor improvements but didn't understand the systematic approach behind them." German fighter pilot training began emphasizing engine shots even more heavily, but this made attacks more difficult and dangerous. Approaching from angles that exposed engines meant flying through defensive fire from multiple bombers. German pilot losses increased as they adapted tactics to counter Wald's innovations. Meanwhile, the original data that had seemed so convincing continued to accumulate. By war's end, the Air Force had documented damage on over 45,000 returned aircraft sorties. The patterns remained consistent: heavy damage to fuselages and wings, minimal to engines and cockpits, exactly as Wald had predicted for surviving aircraft. Each data point validated his theory. The cost of not seeing survivorship bias earlier was sobering. Statistical analysis after the war suggested that implementing Wald's recommendations 6 months earlier could have saved approximately 300 aircraft and 3,000 airmen. These were not abstract numbers, but real lives lost to a cognitive blind spot. In December 1943, 3 months after Wald's initial presentation, the 8th Air Force launched Operation Argument, a series of massive raids on German aircraft production. Despite facing the most intense fighter opposition of the war, loss rates remained manageable. General James Doolittle, who took command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944, credited improved aircraft survivability as crucial to maintaining offensive pressure. "Wald gave us the ability to sustain operations," Doolittle wrote. "Without his work, we would have had to pause, rebuild, retrain. The air war would have extended by months, possibly years." The psychological impact on crews was equally important. Knowing their aircraft had been scientifically protected, that the best mathematical minds in America had worked to keep them safe, improved morale significantly. Letters home from airmen frequently mentioned the new armor and how it made them feel safer, even though they were flying ever more dangerous missions. First Lieutenant William Pickering wrote to his wife in February 1944, "They've added armor in all the right places. Smart fellows figured out where we really need protection. Makes a difference knowing someone that intelligent is looking out for us." The modification program wasn't without controversy. Some bomber groups initially resisted, believing their experience trumped statistical analysis. Colonel Dale Smith of the 384 bomb group argued, "My crews know where they get hit. We don't need some professor telling us where to put armor." But Smith changed his mind after his group's losses dropped 40% in the 2 months following modifications. He later became an advocate for statistical analysis in military planning, often citing his initial skepticism as an example of how experience could mislead. Wald himself remained modest about his contribution. In a rare interview with the Columbia University newspaper in 1944, he said, "I merely applied standard statistical thinking to available data. The real heroes are the airmen who fly these missions and provide us with the data to analyze." His modesty understated the revolutionary nature of his insight. Before Wald, military analysis had been largely experiential, based on what commanders and crews observed. After Wald, it became mathematical, rigorous, considering not just what was seen, but what was unseen. The concept of survivorship bias spread rapidly through military thinking. Naval commanders analyzing submarine losses realized they were only hearing from boats that survived patrols. Army units studying infantry tactics recognized they were learning only from soldiers who lived to share experiences. Each service began collecting data differently, accounting for the missing, not just the survivors. Dr. Warren Weaver, head of the applied mathematics panel that oversaw the SRG, called Wald's work the single most important contribution of statistics to the war effort. This from a panel that had revolutionized everything from code breaking to artillery targeting. The work took its toll on Wald personally. The pressure of knowing lives depended on his calculations, the constant stream of casualty reports he analysed, the photographs of damaged aircraft with visible bloodstains, all weighted heavily. His colleague, Alan Wallace, noted that Wald aged visibly during his war work, his hair greying, deep lines forming around his eyes. Yet Wald continued developing refinements. His third memorandum, submitted in November 1943, addressed optimal armour thickness, not just placement. His fourth examined trade-offs between armour and defensive armament. Each iteration saved more lives, improved survival rates incrementally but measurably. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, every American heavy bomber flying over Europe incorporated Wald's modifications. The massive air support for the invasion, over 11,000 sorties in the first 24 hours, was possible only because loss rates had been reduced to sustainable levels. General Dwight Eisenhower later stated that air superiority, maintained through acceptable bomber losses, was crucial to invasion success. The numbers from D-Day illustrated Wald's impact. Despite intense anti-aircraft fire from German positions, the 8th Air Force lost only 28 bombers from over 1,200 dispatched, a loss rate of 2.3%. A year earlier, before Wald's work, similar intensity operations had loss rates exceeding 10%. Post-war analysis revealed the full scope of Wald's contribution. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted immediately after German surrender, examined crashed American bombers across former Nazi territory. The damage patterns on these lost aircraft confirmed Wald's hypothesis precisely. They showed catastrophic damage to engines, cockpits, and control systems, exactly where Wald had recommended armour placement. German records captured after the war provided another perspective. Luftwaffe squadron logs showed increasing frustration with American bomber durability. One German fighter group commander wrote in December 1943, "The fortresses have become flying tanks. Hits that destroyed them 6 months ago now barely slow them down." The legacy extended beyond military application. Survivorship bias became a fundamental concept in statistics, economics, finance, and medicine. Mutual fund performance analysis, medical treatment studies, business success research, all now account for survivorship bias as standard practice. Wald's insight that missing data could be more important than present data revolutionized multiple fields. In finance, the concept explained why average mutual fund performance seemed positive when including only existing funds, ignoring those that failed and closed. In medicine, it revealed why certain treatments appeared more effective than they actually were, counting only patients who survived long enough to complete treatment. In business, it exposed why copying successful companies often failed, ignoring the invisible graveyard of similar companies that had tried the same strategies. Colonel Jacob Beezer, who would later serve as weaponeer on both atomic bomb missions, studied Wald's work extensively. Wald taught us that in any analysis, you must ask who isn't in the room, who didn't survive to be counted, what data is missing because it died with its source. The human cost of the air war remained staggering despite Wald's improvements. The 8th Air Force alone lost 26,000 killed and 28,000 wounded or captured. But statistical analysis suggested these numbers would have been 30 to 40% higher without survivorship bias-based modifications. That translated to roughly 10,000 additional casualties prevented through mathematical insight. Individual stories illuminated these statistics. Lieutenant Richard Cole, who had flown with Doolittle on the famous Tokyo raid, survived 26 missions over Europe in a modified B-17. "I saw birds, identical to mine, go down from engine hits. The only difference was my engine armour. That's why I'm here talking to you." Sergeant Anthony Picardi, a radio operator, had an even more direct experience. "Took a 20mm cannon shell right to the cockpit armour. Blew a hole in the plexiglass, but the armour stopped it. Pilot got some scratches from glass, that's all. Before Wald, that's 2 dead men and a crashed bomber. The modification program continued evolving through war's end. Each generation of bombers incorporated lessons learned. The B-29 Superfortress, designed with Wald's principles from the start, had the lowest loss rate of any American heavy bomber despite flying the most dangerous missions over Japan. Wald's influence extended to adversary analysis. His methods were used to study German fighter tactics, Japanese naval strategies, even enemy industrial production. The concept that missing data could be more revealing than present data became a cornerstone of intelligence analysis. In March 1945, as the war in Europe neared its end, Wald received a commendation from General Arnold. It read simply, "Your mathematical insight has saved countless American lives. The nation is in your debt." Wald, characteristically, shared credit with his entire SRG team. The war's end didn't end Wald's influence. The newly formed RAND Corporation recruited many SRG members, including several who had worked directly with Wald. They applied survivorship bias analysis to nuclear strategy, space programs, and eventually Vietnam War planning. Tragically, Wald himself didn't live to see his work's full impact. On December 13, 1950, while on a lecture tour in India at the invitation of the Indian government, the Air India DC-3 carrying him and his wife crashed into the Nilgiri Mountains in southern India. He was 48 years old. The irony that someone who had saved so many aircraft should die in a plane crash was not lost on his colleagues. At his memorial service, Frederick Mostella said, "Abraham Wald saw what others could not, the ghosts in the data, the missing pieces that told the real story. He saved more lives with mathematics than most generals save with armies." The final measure of Wald's impact came from the airmen themselves. In 1985, the 8th Air Force Association erected a memorial at their museum in Savannah, Georgia. Alongside memorials to famous commanders and Medal of Honor recipients stands a plaque to Abraham Wald. It reads, "To the mathematician who saw the unseen and saved the unreturned." Retired Technical Sergeant Harold Smith, speaking at the dedication, put it simply, "Most of us never heard his name during the war. But thousands of us came home because of him. He looked at holes in metal and saw men who would live or die. That's mathematics with a soul." The B-17G on display at the museum bears the armor configuration Wald recommended. Docents explained to visitors how a refugee mathematician's insight about missing data saved more American airmen than any single tactical innovation of the war. They point to the armor around the engines, the reinforced cockpit, the protected control cables, all placed not where damage was seen, but where it wasn't. The concept seems obvious now, taught in first-year statistics courses, applied routinely in fields from medicine to marketing. But in 1943, it required genius to see that the bombers that didn't return held the secret to protecting those that would. Abraham Wald's ability to perceive the invisible, to understand that absence of evidence was itself evidence, revolutionized not just military aviation, but the entire approach to data analysis. Today, every time an analyst questions whether their data represents all cases or just survivors, every time a researcher considers what's missing from their sample, every time someone asks, "What am I not seeing?" they honor Wald's legacy. He taught the world that sometimes the most important information is what's not there, that survival itself can blind us to vulnerability, and that mathematics, properly applied, can illuminate truth hidden in plain sight. The final irony is that Wald's own survival story exemplified his theory. He escaped Austria just before the Holocaust consumed the Jewish mathematical community there. Of his University of Vienna colleagues, only those who fled survived to continue their work. The missing data, the murdered mathematicians, represented insights lost forever. Wald survived to revolutionize statistics, but his survival itself was a form of bias, representing only those fortunate enough to escape in time. His work saved hundreds of bomber crews directly and influenced military thinking in ways that saved thousands more. But perhaps his greatest contribution was teaching humanity to question not just what we see, but what we don't see, to always ask who's missing from the room, what data died with its source. In a world drowning in information, Wald's insight remains crucial, that the most important facts might be the ones we'll never collect, the planes that never came home, the stories that ended before they could be told. The mathematics was elegant, the application practical, but the lesson was profound. In trying to protect bombers, Abraham Wald discovered a fundamental truth about knowledge itself. We are all survivors, and our survival shapes what we think we know. Only by acknowledging the missing, counting the uncounted, remembering the unreturned, can we approach real understanding. That insight, born from bullet holes in aluminum, has saved more lives than all the armor ever manufactured.